Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Ukrainian show on POD TV. My name is Sasha Star. I would like to introduce our esteemed guest for today, Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you, Sasha. It's good to be
Great
here.
to have you, as always. Also, we're supposed to have today Ivan from Kiev, Ukraine.
I eagerly await his arrival.
Yeah, okay, we'll wait, and hopefully everything is okay there with the internet, with electricity, so to speak. But we'll find out hopefully real soon. Jonathan, there is very interesting development. Finally, it was officially announced that Emperor Xi is going to Russia, uh, and to his subordinate Mr. Putin. Although it's normally in old days, it was subordinate people would have to visit his ruler, Emperor Xi. But this time it's another way around. It's Emperor Xi is flying to see Putin. Although it was downplayed that he has a few other visits to make, so it's just one of his visits. But because it's been announced and he starts with that, and I'm not aware of any other countries that he's going to visit except Russia. Jonathan, what are your take on this development?
Well, it is quite obvious to outside observers that Russia has reached a very troubling decision point in its current war in Ukraine. Obviously, uh, Mr. Putin had previously tried to explain it to uh, Emperor Xi that the invasion would be over within a few weeks or a few days at most, and that it was be a result in the successful occupation of Ukraine. And when it turned out after a year that this was clearly not the case, now it's interesting to speculate what Emperor Xi is going to say to Mr. Putin once he gets there. Say, okay, where he could very well say, well, where are your results? You said this is only going to take a very short time. This is what else do you expect from us? And right now, would think that uh, a rational observer would conclude that she is wanting to say, look, either produce something or we're going to have to cut our losses, because we cannot afford being exposed like this. So I do not think that China is going to want to, in effect, throw good money after bad by continuing to support Mr. Putin. And I think the real trigger point of this is going to be when Ukraine launches its spring counteroffensive, depending upon how soon that is. My take is that it's going to take place sooner than people expect, because right now the current speculation, well, late spring, which would put it right around May or so, and the you have to wonder, the Ukraine, as I've explained previously, has had a consistent history thus far of exceeding expectations of both its Russian opponent as well as its Western allies, who did not expect Ukraine to hold up this well for this long. So I'm saying, okay, Emperor, that the Emperor's visit, okay, it might be to try to impress the West, or, but I am not convinced that it's going to have any lasting effect. I have found the majority of the opinions so far being voiced are that this is going to be a long war that could last for years. And again, my practice has always been to find a contrarian point of view to as compared to what the majority of people are saying, and then support it as best I can. It's commonly called in the intelligence community. That's commonly called the devil's advocate technique. So the where in the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope would often, when they were approaching a contentious theological issue, he would appoint a bishop to take the opposite viewpoint, and that bishop was referred to as the devil's advocate. So now I'm sort of put in the role of the devil's advocate. I'm saying this is going to be a shorter war than the long war that is currently being assumed in the West and by Russia.
Excellent point, Jonathan. It's so unclear, and there are so many points of view, and some are convinced that that's going to be, as you described, the long war. On the other hand, both for Russia and Ukraine, there are a lot of mm, thoughts about that it's not going to be a long war, but it should be over by the end of this year. In case of Ukraine, I could see that if there will be indeed a very strong counterattack by Ukraine, say the end of April, first half of May, if what I expect, I could be wrong just as well, that they will cut to the south, maybe somewhat east Melitopol, right to the south. They will cut off the all this west from that line, all western groups of armies of Russia, and they will be extremely close to taking over the Crimea. And with this certain weapons and ammunition, it's indeed possible that in the next few months they will take over Crimea, and that alone will spell the end of war. I don't care about the Donbas region, because Russia without Crimea, they would have to uprise against Putin and his government, because he lost something what was essentially a crown of all his life, is to get Crimea to Russia. He's done it in 2014, and all of a sudden 8 years later he is losing it. That's not going to be forgiven, and that could be just as well as the end of the war. So okay, it doesn't depend on the overall strength of armies of Russia and Ukraine, because if you look at now of Russian ability to provide the fresh troops, mobilize hundreds of thousands of people, and whether they are properly equipped or not, but they're sent to the front lines, and even there's only one rifle for two people, so one will die, but then another one still can kill one or two more people. It's just incredible.
The Russians were doing pretty much the same thing in World War One. There
Yeah.
weren't enough weapons, and so when a soldier was killed, the unarmed soldier picked up the weapon and continued.
Mhm.
So it's very reminiscent of World War One. And again, as we've previously discussed, this particular battle for Bakhmut is becoming similar to a similar effect to that of the Battle of Verdun on the Western Front in World War One, except that whereas in World War One, both sides, the French and the Germans, were heavily bled, not to the advantage of either one or the other, well, possibly to the slight advantage of the Germans, because it wore down the French comparatively more, but not that much. In this case, you have the Ukrainians wearing down the Russians at an astonishing rate compared to the Battle of Verdun, and they're taking very
At
large
least
casualties.
5-1. At
Five to
least five
one
to one.
is what I've heard reported. That's right, and so the Russians cannot keep that up. It cannot keep that up indefinitely. And if the Ukrainian counteroffensive is timed just right, it may force the Russians to break off from Bakhmut because they will have to reestablish their defense elsewhere.
John, I would like to share with you, there is one source. It's a newspaper very popular in Ukraine, calls Ukrainskaya Pravda, Ukrainian.
Ukrainian truth.
Yeah, it's a news from the front line. It's basically online publication about Ukraine, and they have English version as well. So on the very first page, every day they showed the losses of Russian army in men category. So far, their number overall is 163,320. Yesterday, it was there were 760 Russian soldiers were killed, and this is the first day in several weeks, at least 2, 3 weeks, that the number is less than 1,000. Believe it or not, it's the first day I'm watching this every day to get all the latest news. So it's the first day in more than 2, 3 weeks that it was less than 1,000 killed. So if the number is 1,000 a day, there are 365 days a year. So are we talking about
365,000.
365,000?
They're on a rate for 365,000. Yeah, it's impressive. I think
Is.
the reason their casualties are lower that day is because not so much a lack of it's not it's not so much an increase in skill, it's a decrease in logistics. They just don't have the logistics to push those people faster into the meat grinder.
Well, what's happening is that the major force in Bakhmut, of course, is this Putin's chief, Mr. Prigozhin, and his Wagner group. So they were fiercely fighting, losing a lot of men, most of them probably convicts. And a few days ago, he announced that all his telephone lines to the Russian commanding, uh, 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 this, uh, how you call it, and the commanders such as Gerasimov, for example, all his lines were cut off. He cannot call, he cannot communicate, he cannot ask for more, whatever he needs, ammunition or anything like this. No, not at all. In the meantime, they are in their drive to show how successful and strong they are, and they wanted to get Bakhmut, actually. They are completely away from the major Russian forces, and now they're scared they will be all encircled by Ukrainians and simply will be chopped to pieces. That's where they are now. They don't know what they do. What they're trying to steal, to attack, to get through. Where are they going to get through? So they will be killed wherever they will get, or
Break
they will
through to
fall back.
where?
Yeah, or they
They
have
don't
to.
want to break through to the West. They would rather break through back to Russia at this
But
point.
I wouldn't be surprised if Russians will start killing them because they are leaving the front lines. So,
Well, the NK remember in World War II,
yeah,
the Russian equivalent of the KGB back then, the NKVD, they would often follow behind a Russian offensive and shoot anyone who did not continue to advance towards the Nazis.
this units were called SMERSH. SMERSH means смерть шпионам, death to the spies, so to speak. So, and they were actually killing people. People who went for the attack, they couldn't get back, even if they wouldn't have any arms, anything. They just couldn't get back. So a lot of people, they were actually had to surrender to Germans. A lot of Russians did during Second World War. There were, remember the infamous army by General Vlasov, who actually fought against Soviet armies.
Yeah, the General Vlasov's Army of the Damned.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that I just read just latest publication of Foreign Affairs, and very interesting article is the surprising success of U.S. military aid to Ukraine, and they're basically saying. That so far it's doing extremely successful, and they're using their experience to supply arms to Afghanistan and Iraq and all this what's happened before. They're doing now a way much more efficient job to supply exactly what's needed, when needed, and providing very good management to it. Jonathan, what's your opinion on that?
Well, the U.S. Army since World War II, well, since even earlier than that, the U.S. Army's ability to supply its troops, its logistics system has always been first rate. It got even better during World War II. It was
Mhm.
just amazing. And their German opponents were just absolutely dazzled by the fact that the American Army was supplying machine guns down to company and even platoon level. They have the 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 amount of firepower available to an American squad often exceeded the firepower available to a German company. So it was just that much. It was that efficient. And ever since then, the U.S. Army's logistics system, they have it refined to a very high level of science, logistical science. And they have been able to, this has aided the U.S. power projection capability. And the U.S. Army is also taking very careful notes about the success of what has been working in the Russian-Ukrainian war so far. And the U.S. Army will incorporate these lessons learned into any future engagements that the U.S. Army itself may have to take part in. So right now, the U.S. Army is sort of learning from the Ukrainians and their ability to adapt and improvise, a capability for improvisation which rivals even the American reputation for improvisation.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm glad to your historical comparison. And I would like to mention that Russians are not great on logistics, never were.
Nope.
However, during the Second World War, what was German surprised and couldn't handle is the sheer size of Russian artillery units, tanks, the warplanes. The size of it was enormous. I'm not saying that their tanks were much better than German tanks or anything. It doesn't matter. If for each one German tanks you have 10 even inferior Russian tanks, it's more than enough. And but remember, unlike now, at that time Russia turned all its economy to the like a war machine. It was all its economy was essentially a war machine, and a lot of women were working in all those factories producing more and more ammunition and weapons and just anything. And the Germans just couldn't handle the sheer size of what Russia produced.
Well, in the United States as well, the United States became the world's most efficient war machine,
Yeah,
and they had cranking out incredible numbers of weapons. And this supposition of being able to build essentially a 10 million man armed force was based upon the assumption that women in the United States would enter the labor force in large numbers, which they did.
they
They
did.
were tired of being housewives. They wanted to be support the war effort. They wanted to work. They joined the workforce in large numbers, and it is not much of an exaggeration to say that in World War II for the Americans, the men fought the battles and the women built the weapons, and that was very much the case. And so, uh, and right now, the U.S. war machine, if it is encountering difficulties, it is because it is keeping its war machine active enough to produce weapons for normal American requirements. But we have not gone to full mobilization. We do not deem it necessary. But right now, and of course, given the current economic situation uh, in the United States, it's not certain how long we could maintain full war mobilization, even if we were given if we had to do so. As it is right now, American technological superiority of their weaponry being utilized properly by the Ukrainians has made a big difference. So right now, if the Ukrainian army can exceed the expectations of both the Russians and its Western allies and execute a successful counteroffensive with what they have, never mind what they're about to get, uh, then I predict a shorter war than most people expect.
Absolutely. And don't forget that the Russian troops are not motivated at all. They don't understand what they're doing to Ukraine and what is their goal. And as Putin eloquently said recently, that, well, look, all these men, they'll die sooner or later because of their drunks or because they will fall into auto accidents and whatever. So it's better if if they will die on the front lines for Mother Russia.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Of course, you also noticed that there was a recent article I saw today in that the Russians are apparently preparing in Crimea for a massive. It looks like they're preparing for a mass evacuation,
Yes. Yes, that's true.
and that evacuation could very well be triggered uh, as soon as the Ukrainians launch a counteroffensive. Once it becomes apparent that that counteroffensive is aimed at Crimea.
Also, don't believe um, it's not just Russians who moved to Crimea after 2014. It's also a lot of collaborators who acted together with Russians when the Crimea was actually annexed by Russians, and so they fear even more than those new Russians who just came to Crimea after 2014,
Yeah.
and all of them will try to evacuate.
Right. One additional historical comparison that I should point out is that during the Persian Gulf War, 1991, when there was a lot of speculation in the press about uh, the nature of how General Schwarzkopf was going to execute his offensive against the Iraqi army. And there was a great deal of speculation. The conventional wisdom at that point was that the American armed forces were going to be attacking the Iraqi entrenched positions. Yeah, and they were talking about what kind of casualties could they expect from that from going against the Iraqi defenses, and they were overestimating the capability of the Iraqis to resist an American advance. And instead, of course, what caught everyone by surprise was Schwarzkopf's end run through the desert. Yeah,
It
through
was
the desert.
spectacular.
It was spectacular, yes. And within a few days, the Iraqi armed forces were routed, and they completely bypassed those entrenched positions that the Iraqis had prepared, and thus defying all of the expectations in the West of this big trench battle. What it would have amounted to had they gone straight against the Iraqi defenses. They had no intention to do it. They completely bypassed it, and the superior American logistical capability came in handy once again as they were able to sustain that advance. And the other interesting thing is that President Bush Sr. was he made the decision to stop at having liberated Kuwait and not try to advance into Baghdad into Iraq. And it's very noteworthy what his response was when he was asked why he was not advancing on Baghdad. And wise man, much wiser man than he was than his successors, he said his response: he did not want to get caught in the middle of a civil war.
Yeah, that's what
And
happened with his son.
yeah,
During
and unfortunately, his son did not learn the lesson that his father was trying to teach him. But
Mhm.
in any case, that's it. But the defying of conventional wisdom and of the what everyone else thinks is going to happen, I predict that is going to happen here once again. Things are not going to go the way the West or Russia uh, think it's going to happen. I predict a Crimean counteroffensive to retake Crimea, and that those Crimean defenses will collapse a lot faster. Especially, and the Russians seem to be admitting this tacitly without coming out and saying it, simply by virtue of the fact that they appear to be preparing for a mass evacuation of Crimea.
Jonathan, I
It-
have a feel that the money which were allocated for all these fortresses in Crimea, they were gone without building any fortresses. That's
right.
what I feel.
Yeah, the fortresses will turn out to be hollow. They are not going
Yeah,
to. It probably went into the pockets of other people that have nothing to do with building defenses in Crimea.
Well, they're very practical people because if they would spend all this money being real fortresses, and these fortresses sooner or later would be demolished, so why spend this money when they can allocate them to some other more purposeful needs, perhaps? Now, speaking about Bush Senior, actually, let's start with Reagan. How geopolitically, since 1945, Russia was by far the most and probably the only one serious enemy of the Western United States for 40 years at least. So, how he could fall for the charms of Gorbachev and later Yeltsin, the Ronald Reagan and the later Bush Sr., and all of a sudden they became fascinated with oh, new democratic Russia. They're brilliant people. They're our friends. We fought together in Second World War and so on. How that could easily happen so easily? And when Putin came to power and it all started to unravel, the United States very late came to realization that that was very naive, that nothing of that is truth. What's your opinion?
Well, President Reagan, when he announced the Strategic Defense Initiative in 1983, and the purpose being to try to find ways to render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete, that absolutely terrified the Soviet leadership, and they saw that from their standpoint, Reagan was being diabolically brilliant, and that he was trying to use American technology to neutralize the one main means of leverage the Soviet Union had over the United States. One thing that made them a great power in their own eyes, their nuclear weapons arsenal. And if they, you know, and also the KGB in April 1985 had sent Gorbachev a report on the SDI, in which they said that their KGB's estimate was that the U.S. SDI program would eventually be able to block 90% of Soviet missiles in a first strike, and there was no way the Soviet Union could keep up with this capability. Now, mind you, even our most optimistic people on our side were not willing to say that we would have had that capability or would be able to attain it, but it did not matter. The Russians believed it. They acted on that belief, and they spent themselves into bankruptcy trying to counter a phantom SDI program, which was essentially R&D. Now, I would argue now that thanks to other later technological developments, such as Elon Musk's development of reusable spacecraft, that makes an upgrading of the U.S. Space Force with its own space fleet possible. And in turn, once that is possible, then you can actually construct a global ballistic missile defense system that, unlike the ideas being floated in the 1980s, with that kind of space fleet armed properly, you would be able to, the US and NATO acting in concert, would be able to neutralize the one thing that makes Russia a great power at all. And that is, I contend, what the Russian leadership fears more than anything else. They don't dare say it. They don't
Mhm.
dare say it, but they're thinking it. And that is why they react so strongly to any mention of increasing Ukraine's ballistic missile defense capability or of that of the West in general. It is a threat not to Russian lives, it is a threat to Russian power.
Well, now it's apparent that obviously Russia is not going to disappear anywhere. It creates now, or at least trying to create a huge alliance with China and with Iran, never mind North Korea, so the usual suspects. And that creates a threat to uh, NATO, to United States, and by the way, to Israel as well, because if Iran will get the material needed for nuclear warheads, they could do it in a about in 2 months' time, and there could be the Israelis' very quick reaction once they will realize that Iran is, say, a month, 2 months from the creation of its nuclear device. I think that Israel will react very strongly. It could be predicted. What do you think?
Well, if Israel perceives that Iran is on the verge of having an actual nuclear capability, they will react with a preemptive strike, much the way they did back when they saw that Iraq had the potential or the
Yeah,
potential.
40 years ago,
Yep,
exactly.
they will react. They will destroy it, and because it's to them, it's a matter of their very existence being at stake.
Absolutely. So this situation in the world is not very peaceful, especially now that China was able to engineer a peace between, or cooperation, should I say, Iran and Saudi Arabia, which were two great enemies for so long. So Russia is very active on political front. With Emperor Xi is visiting Russia. I think he's flying on Monday to see Mr. Putin, to say. And we'll see the next developments. In the meantime, Ukraine is indeed preparing its great offensive, hopefully in a few weeks' time. And
I think it's going to be a work of art.
yes, yes, it will surprise a lot of people. That's what I've heard. So, Jonathan, thank you so much for today's program. And we'll see you on Tuesday. And hopefully,
Excellent.
Ivan will join us. By the way, I think I know why one didn't make today.
Why?
I think I forgot to mention to him about time change on Sunday.
Ooh.
I think this is partly my
You mean
fault.
he's gonna get you mean he's gonna get here in another half hour and you say, "Hey, where is
Yes,
everybody? Where is everybody?"
yes. I already
Or
sent him
or
email.
or today is St. Patrick's Day here in the United
Oh
States.
yes, yes,
That's
yes,
right, yes. My wife and I are going to go out and celebrate St. Patrick's Day. Relatively
yes.
early in the day, mind you. We don't wanna be celebrating St. Patrick's Day when everybody else is, if you know what I mean. That
Yeah,
can get rather
yeah, yeah.
dangerous.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Jonathan, and we'll see you on Tuesday. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye bye.